It's the week ending Saturday, the 4th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Michael Fallon resigning as Defence Secretary as sexual harassment claims rock Westminster, the former President of Catalonia escaping to Brussels, and a terror attack in New York, leaving 8 dead. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Kari, Wilkins and Holden Frith, and from the week junior, Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week, it is Felicity. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
An unholy row brewing in the early hours of the morning.
But then I don't think the celebration of the Reformation needs to be a celebration of heroes. What we celebrate is the discovery by a very flawed man of the Bible's message to us flawed people of the generous love of a gracious God.
And that was Thought for the Day with Dr. Michael Banner. The time is 10 to 8.
John Humphrys there, wasting away after another 3 minutes of Thought for the Day on the Today programme. Felicity, John Humphrys has been bad-mouthing the feature, hasn't he, to the Radio Times?
Yes.
What's he said?
Well, it's not just John Humphrys, it was the whole of the Today presenters who did an interview for the Radio Times to celebrate 60 years of the show. And in this, Humphrys called it deeply, deeply boring and irrelevant, while Justin Webb said he was sick of hearing the message that Jesus was really nice. Michelle Hussein also chimed in to say that it was good punctuation because it reminded her that it was 7:50 and she needed to get out of the house. So safe to say the rest of the Today team aren't particularly thrilled with Thought for the Day, which has been a long-standing feature of the Today programme.
Yeah, and the only kind of respite from news, I guess, in the show. I mean, I know they do sport and they do cultural stories and they do the weather and stuff, but I mean, it's not even soft news, is it? It is often just a complete break from anything topical. Yeah,
it's about 2 minutes, 40 seconds, and I think a lot of people see it as a sort of oasis of calm and a moment to reflect in what is otherwise the presenters sort of barking questions at a load of hapless politicians about Westminster and politics and current affairs in the wider world. So I think some people think it's a really nice time to reflect and hear from a religious figure, to see the world through the lens of religion. But other people say that it goes unchallenged, it's not criticised in the way that the rest of the programme is, and therefore it shouldn't be a part of the programme anymore.
Thoughts, everyone? Is John Humphrys right? Is it time to end Thought for the Day?
I think you have to accept that perhaps it's not aimed at John Humphrys. I don't know what his religious views are, but there is still a considerable majority of people who do believe in God, and surely they're entitled to their...
Well, considerable minority, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, that's the point.
Yes, but surely they're still entitled to their 3 minutes per day out of this 3-hour show, in the same way, a lot of people aren't interested in sport, but you accept that many people are, and you put up with the sports news.
That was the argument that Reverend Giles Fraser made in The Guardian, wasn't it, Holden? He said, OK, half the country isn't interested, but that does mean half are. But then that's still lumping together Muslims and Hindus and Jews with Christians to say they're interested in the Christian message, and I'm not sure that is right.
I actively avoid Thought for the Day. It's often around about 10 to 8 when I'm turning the radio on, and if I see it is 10 to 8, I will wait for a few minutes until the danger has passed. The problem for me is that it feels so out of keeping with the pace of the rest of the programme. As you were saying earlier, I think maybe in the early days when broadcasting was generally a bit more stilted, it maybe was more in keeping with that general tone. But now it often feels as if a fairly meaty topic is being hurried along or cut off, and then just 3 minutes of fairly pointless meandering. The fact that it's religious isn't really the issue for me. It's the blandness of so much of what is said. It sometimes feels like it's a kind of version of just a minute in which, instead of repetition, you have to avoid saying anything of interest at all.
OK, Kari, you were defending it. Were you playing God's advocate, or do you actually like it?
A little bit of God's advocate. I mean, possibly what they need to do is just update it a bit, bring in different religious views, actually have a religious debate in 3 minutes if you can.
I certainly think there should be more secular, or any secular thoughts allowed to air, and I think there should be a better balance between Christians and other faiths. I think it's very, very rare that you have a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu. For me, it is about the religious element, and actually I think it doesn't really matter whether you're religious or not, or how much of the population has a religion, because for me, it's the idea that if you strip religion out of the collective consciousness, you run the risk of failing to understand or hear from people with different perspectives. And actually, so many world events are about religion, or in my day-to-day, I don't hear from a lot of Muslims or Hindus about how their faith affects them. And I think this is actually a really important segment where you do get to hear
Yes,
that.
but you don't hear from a conservative Islamic preacher from Turkey. You know, if you did, that might help you understand what's happening in the Middle East, but that's not what you hear. You hear, regardless of what religion they're practicing, a sort of happy-clappy Anglican, everyone get along liberal version of religion, don't you?
I think when you're hearing from the other religions, it almost adds more pressure on them to prove that their religion is also inoffensive. It's as inoffensive and...
We like women too.
Yeah. John Humphrys suggested that there should be secular voices there too. I think that could end up making it worse, because secular people are just as capable of blandness as religious people.
I think that the point is that if it's a thought for the day, and it's not a religious thought for the day, if it's a sort of philosophical / spiritual / mindfulness thought for the day, that there's no reason anymore for that only to come from someone with a religious background. That you can reach that point of view from being a holistic therapist or from being a life coach. Why do you have to be a priest or a rabbi?
I agree. I think there should be a balance. I think you should be able to hear from religious people, and I think you should be able to hear philosophical thoughts from secular people. I think that John Humphrys also describing it as deeply, deeply boring is deeply, deeply unhelpful, and it's sort of pompous, and it's not incisive. It's not an incisive critique, and that also slightly jars with people, and I think that's why there's been a lot of rancour from people, because, you know, if they really do have a problem with it, it should be an internal editorial dispute that they take up. But I think to just air it as deeply, deeply boring, it's just not helpful somehow.
That sort of knowing media sneeringness at people's beliefs, which is not what they're there for.
Yeah, exactly.
This has become a sort of symbolic last bastion for people who feel that the BBC is trying to sideline religion. It probably feels to me like it's the wrong symbol of that, because it doesn't feel like religion at its best. But I don't think Thought for the Day will ever be scrapped, because it has become so totemic. And after the new editor of the Today programme, Sarah Sands, suggested that secular voices might get a shot, the BBC actually felt it necessary to come out and make a statement that there would be no changes to Thought for the Day. It would remain as it was. Sarah Sands came out and said she was a big admirer of the slot. The BBC is clearly very worried about upsetting fans of Thought for the Day, or people who feel that that's their one safe space within this programme.
It also ties into the wider criticism of Sands, doesn't it, that she is making these changes, so perhaps it's like at least they can keep this as a symbol of continuity when she is revolutionising the show in so many other ways, I think in good ways, personally. Well,
let's talk about some of that. I don't want to get too media insidery on that, but from the point of view that the Today programme is this totemic show, it does, that plus Radio 2, Chris Evans' breakfast show, which also has a religious slot in it, taken together, make up the majority of breakfast radio listening in this country. Do you think the Today programme does actually reflect the Britain that it's broadcasting to?
I think under Sands it is more so. She's bringing it more up to date and adapting to changes in the way we communicate, the way we cover news. You know, she's widening the scopes. It's not just so-called serious news. She's also putting in what she rather unfortunately called more girls stuff, which, I think she was trying to be ironic, but it didn't really come through.
I think that really backfired. I think that, turns off a lot of men from a subject that probably they would find really interesting.
But she meant lifestyle magazine content, didn't she? Which has typically been more female skewing. I appreciate girl stuff is an unpleasant phrase.
But I think she is revolutionising it in some ways. I think she's done more things on fashion. I think there was a big fury over when she dedicated so much time to British Fashion Week when North Korea had just fired a missile over Japan, and I think people were sort of wondering why she'd given so much prime time to these fashionistas. But I think she sees it as maybe she wants to draw in more readers, and it's not just a sort of middle class journos and elites who are listening to this. Let's open it out and talk about culture and interviews and that sort of thing. Which
listeners, they're called on radio, not readers. But I'll forgive you.
They're our readers.
Yes, sure. You've chosen this, though, Felicity, as your story of the week. Why? I mean, Thought for the Day is not new. Scepticism from the presenters probably isn't new, although they may not have voiced it quite so explicitly before. So what's changed?
I feel it's a turning point in that Sarah Sands' editorship is going to change things, and I think that'll be interesting because Today does set the news agenda. I also think it struck me that John Humphrys increasingly is getting his name in the headlines pretty much for all the wrong reasons, and I wonder whether the listeners now are slightly too frustrated with some of the lines that he has come out with. So I wonder whether his deeply, deeply boring comment is going to be a turning point and instigate bigger change.
I predict that in 10 years' time, John Humphrys will still be there.
I
But
think it's a national sport, isn't it? Getting angry about things that John Humphrys says. We love it.
Yeah. Kari, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think this will be the week that we ask again who, if anyone, should be barred from voting.
No, I can absolutely give the honourable gentleman that assurance. The House of Commons has voted against prisoners having the vote. I don't want prisoners to have the vote, and they shouldn't get the vote. I'm very clear about that. If it helps by having another vote in Parliament on another resolution to make absolutely clear, to help put the legal position beyond doubt, I'm very happy to do that. But no one should be in any doubt. Prisoners are not getting the vote under this government.
David Cameron, remember him? Speaking in the House of Commons back in 2012, when, Kari, that was the view of, well, I suppose of the coalition government then, wasn't it? Tories and Lib Dems together. Is that the view of the Conservative government now?
No, well, not entirely. This week there were reports that the government's planning to lift its blanket ban on prisoners being allowed to vote, albeit it's only going to affect possibly as few as 100 prisoners. It will only affect those who are serving less than 12 months and qualify for day release. And this is out of an entire prison population of 73,000 inmates who would be eligible to vote if the ban were lifted.
So the argument is if you're eligible for day release anyway, why not have day release on the day you can vote?
Yeah, it's not going to affect many people, safe to say. I mean, a lot of people are asking if it's actually just a cynical attempt by the government to do the bare minimum because of this ongoing battle that's been happening since 2005 with the European Court of Human Rights, who say that a blanket ban is effectively breaching prisoners' human rights.
Talk us through that then, in as layman's terms as you can. It's been going on for so long, so, I mean, why bother trying to compromise on it now?
I would imagine because we're trying to get on the right side of Europe during the Brexit negotiations. But again, it is really just a token gesture. But it does raise the issue, and it's caused a lot of outrage. I mean, Tory MPs coming out saying they're disgusted by it. David Cameron back in the day said that the idea of prisoners voting made him feel physically sick, being a bit of a drama queen. And, you know, lots of papers like the Daily Mail are, again, up in arms, you know, inmates are going to run the country, that sort of thing. But it does raise the question of why have we taken away this basic civic right? It's surely a separate issue from why they're in prison.
So why have we done it, Holden? Why does it matter? Because it polls well, doesn't it? The British public actually do tend to agree that prisoners shouldn't have the vote.
Yeah, I know this breaks all of the rules of podcasting, but I actually struggle to muster up all that much of a strong opinion about this. I can see the argument that if you have committed a crime serious enough to land you in prison, that losing the right to vote could be part of that punishment. The reason the European Court of Justice took issue with it is because that it's a blanket ban that affects all crimes regardless of seriousness. But so this seems like a reasonable compromise to get out of that, really. You know, if you're already on day release, if that happens to coincide with an election, I certainly wouldn't want to stop those people voting.
But if you're banned from driving, you can be banned from driving for 3 months, or you can be banned from driving for 2 years, and during that period you cannot drive. I mean, surely if you're in prison and you've had your rights taken away, the most basic right is that to vote. So it's unfortunate timing, but there you go.
But that punishment is to fit the crime. Your driving licence is taken away because you have committed a driving offence.
But you're in prison because you've been a bad citizen.
But you're still a citizen. That is the key right of citizens, is to vote. It's the most basic democratic right. You know, in 13 other European countries, including Belgium, France, Germany, being disqualified to vote depends on the crime you've committed or the length of the sentence. So, for example, in Germany, prisoners lose the vote if they are convicted of crimes that target the state or democratic order. So a burglar wouldn't lose the vote, but someone convicted of terrorism or political violence would. So surely it's about making the punishment fit the crime.
OK, but why shouldn't a burglar lose the vote? I mean, if they happen to be in prison on the day of the vote, you know, they also can't go to Glastonbury. I mean, there's lots of things you can't do when you're in prison. I mean, how far do you take this? Should MPs be able to have surgeries with prisoners? Because that's part of your rights, to go and speak to your MP.
Just linking to that, one thing I found very ironic is that a serving MP who is sentenced to a prison term of 12 months or less can keep his or her seat in Parliament while they're in prison. They just can't vote while they're in prison.
Can they vote in Parliament? So they could vote?
No, they just keep their seat.
Right.
I think it would be a good thing if more politicians were forced to take the problems of prisoners seriously and had to go canvassing in prisons and see what conditions are like. Because actually, the parallel story to this is how shockingly awful prisons in this country are. And I think for prisoners, if you take away their right to vote, what's the alternative for them? Is it to riot and to raise the roof and to cause havoc? Yeah, clearly it is, because we see that quite a lot. I feel like there's far more stories of prisoners. They have no other outlet to express their frustration.
But do you really think it's going to stem rioting by giving prisoners the vote?
Why not? Yeah, I think that's...
Why not? I mean, that's not what they're rioting about. They're rioting because they haven't got access to the TV or their food isn't good enough.
You don't know that. They might be rioting because they don't think anyone's taking them seriously and they feel dehumanised.
Is it not? Yeah, exactly. Is it not part of a wider issue that a lot of people end up in prison because they already feel marginalised?
Prisoners have had the right to vote in European elections in the UK since 2005.
And that didn't stem the rioting? Are you crazy?
Not a cure-all solution, but it's giving them that right to free speech. They are still citizens. And if prison's about rehabilitation and reintegration into society, you know, if you're in for 3 months and you've got to go out and then be under whichever government you didn't vote for, or at least have a say in.
But that's the same argument for kids voting, isn't it? 16-year-olds didn't get a say in the referendum, and yet they're going to grow up in a world where we're Brexiting. But,
yes, but they're
you know,
kids.
The nature of their birth meant they weren't old enough to vote. If you're in prison, you can't vote.
They're not considered mature enough. But I think you can assume that someone in prison probably still has reasonable enough intelligence to vote. I don't think that's the issue.
I suppose there is the point you were just saying, Felicity, about, okay, it might canvass well in prison. If an MP goes to prison to speak to prisoners, it's not going to look good on the news at 10 for everyone else.
I just wish politicians who I think a lot of them are out of touch with the concerns of people across a whole swathe of society. I think it would be extremely interesting to see them go into some of these prisons and actually see what's going on. And this could be a really good way to force them to do that if they actually have to campaign for the votes of prisoners.
I tried to work out whether there were any constituencies in which prisoners could effectively hold the balance of power. It's quite difficult to find out. The only concrete example I found was South Dorset, which includes Portland Prison, which has a population of 500. In 1997 and 2001, that constituency majority was less than 100. So the prisoners could actually have swung the election. Although in 2001, 2/3 of them would have had to vote Conservative in order to have any impact on the outcome.
But overall, I don't think people need to be worried that prisoners are effectively going to be choosing our next government. It's not going to make that big a difference.
But doesn't that mean then that this won't have the solution that Felicity was hoping, that politicians will have to pay attention to them because they have the vote?
I think it would still be a factor. I mean, politicians are going to go after every vote they can get, whether that's canvassing door to door or canvassing in prison. And at least it would give prisoners a voice. And surely it's all part of the we're a democracy, aren't we? Britain's the only Western European country that has a blanket ban on prisoners voting.
Although several others effectively have a similar ban. So Ireland, there's no official ban, but if you're in prison, you can't vote.
I thought it was the case that they made that you could if you really went and pushed for it.
That seems even sneakier to say you can have the vote, but we're going to go out of our way to make it so hard for you to deal with it. Yeah, exactly. We're going to hide it.
If it is true that this is being done, this concession, this compromise is being done to pave the way for Brexit negotiations by saying to the European Court of Human Rights, well, we're taking your concerns seriously and trying to do something to match you. That's a bit ironic, isn't it? If people voted for Brexit for more independence, and then the result of that is that we end up doing more compromises and fudges, that's not what anyone voted for.
Yeah, but it's also a compromise. I don't think Europe's going to... I think it's so little, almost, that I can't imagine they're going to be that impressed with it. And in this country, I don't think there's any parliamentary or popular backing.
Labour back it.
I still feel like it's a really bizarre political move right now when the Tory government is so weak that they would bring up this issue when there's absolutely no calls for it. There's no calls for it to act. I think it's going to be deeply unpopular. I would just have left it well alone.
Okay, and we've debated around the issue, but just on a yes or no referendum, would you give prisoners the vote, yes or no, Felicity?
Yes.
Kari, you seem to be swaying towards yes.
I would give prisoners the vote if they had committed certain crimes, but not if they had...
So you support this, basically?
Murder,
okay, and Holden?
Yeah, I'm fine with this compromise. I don't feel any urgency to extend it beyond that to more serious crimes.
Okay, I'm not. I don't think prisoners should have the vote, but I welcome you listening to this podcast. If you're behind bars, please feel free to check out all my work. Holden, it's your turn. What would you like to bring to our attention this week?
Well, it seems it really is a fool who plays it cool by making the world a little colder.
Ideally, one day, it will be as desirable to be called warm as it currently is to be labelled cool. There will be lists of the 40 warmest men under 40. Boys will come home from school and complain to their mothers, "I can't do it, I don't know how to be warm." Girls at fashionable bars will take mental notes of where the warm guys are sitting. And in the secret soul of every man, there will be a quiet, steady yearning to be as warm as they possibly can.
That was the Week Unwrap's New Thought for the Day section with Alain de Botton speaking on the School of Life's YouTube channel. At the risk of sounding like a news quiz question, Holden, why are warm men making headlines this week?
Because University College London has published research which suggests that British men now value mental health over physical health, and that married men are happier than single men, and that men would rather be reliable, honest and dependable than athletic, adventurous and creative.
OK, and this, says Martin Daubney in Telegraph Men, is the end of the metrosexual. That would be a big thing if we really were seeing a generational shift in male attitudes, but is it true?
It's interesting the way this has been picked up in the media and actually how little it has been, because part of the coverage has been the idea that it's the end of the metrosexual, although Martin Daubney then goes on to say he's been killed off by a new sensitive man. That was in the Telegraph. Another Telegraph article was headlined "The Return of Traditional Man." And the Times headline was something like, "Macho, no, he just wants to be Mr. Reliable." This actually reflects the fact that the research paints a fairly complicated picture of masculinity, actually. And I think at a time when the behaviour of men and the misbehaviour of men is in the headlines thanks to people such as Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Michael Fallon, and the debate around masculinity has become quite polarised, this is a really useful way of trying to kind of delve down into the question without painting it in political extremes.
Or it could just be that actually if you were to have polled women as well, you'd find that everyone's more sensitive about mental health because that's been a real issue over the past few years. And everyone is thinking more about their physical health in terms of their actual physical benefit rather than the way they look. And that isn't a male-female split at all. That's just this current generation of informed people.
It seems to be more of a societal split. You know, we've gone beyond that. Every woman has to be a size 0 and every man has to be a sort of a beefcake. But yeah, that's a wider, healthier attitude society-wide, isn't it?
When I was reading some of the responses, though, to the study, I mean, isn't this just what you would say? They were sort of...
You're not going to go, God, I hate women, I just want them for their look sort of thing, are you?
It's easier to say than to do a lot of these things, kind of caring about mental health. But I think that in itself still constitutes a change, that if a majority of men are prepared to say this to interviewers now, I'm not sure that would have been the case 20 years ago. I'm certain it wouldn't have been 40 years ago. It seems to suggest that we're more comfortable with the idea that men are complicated and complex and almost like real human beings. It's sort of, wow. I think there used to be this idea that women were complicated, men were simple, and this actually did huge disservice to both. And it meant, concentrating on men as this is the topic, it meant that men who did feel complicated emotions like anxiety perhaps felt that they were failing in their masculinity, that this was a sign of weakness.
Yeah, I think anything that breaks down these very simplistic stereotypes of men and women can only be a good thing that should be applauded. But it made me think of, there was a programme on BBC Two a while ago called No More Boys and Girls, Can Our Kids Go Gender Free?, which was a really interesting social experiment with a group of primary school kids. The girls' coat cupboard was pink and the boys had the blue area in it. And they decided to do away with all of that and try and bring up these kids gender free. And it was really fascinating because actually these boys from a very young age, when they were interviewed, they already sort of instinctively knew that it's not okay to cry if you're a boy. They all struggled to express their emotions. They had to be strong. These were words that kept on coming out. And the girls, from a scarily young age, thought, I need to be pretty, like that's a currency that I have to have. It's really pernicious, and I think it is a good thing if that can infiltrate down sooner the better from men today, but these stereotypes are just not helpful or accurate.
Kari.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see, you know, with metrosexual, it was embracing this so-called feminine thing of taking an interest in your looks, using cosmetics, that sort of thing. And you could say this is the next stage. It's now embracing that so-called feminine quality of showing sensitivity and that sort of thing. So it does appear to be a sort of a slow trickle down.
There is an aspirational aspect to this. This is how men want to be seen rather than necessarily how they are. But I think part of it is perhaps trying to get away from the idea that those are feminine quality. Yeah. And I know you were sort of putting air quotes around them, but being able to show your vulnerability is actually a sign of the strength of your masculinity rather than something that undermines it, which I think has previously been the general impression.
Well, except if you listen to what some of the participants in this survey are actually saying, they're not saying they're happy. You know, they're saying there is a contradiction between what I'm expected to do in terms of, and this is men in their sort of late 20s, presenting an image of myself on Tinder so that basically I can get laid, and how I feel about that, which is actually I'd like to settle down with a partner, be happy, eat what I want, and all the rest of it. So that there's how they feel they want their role as a man in society to be, but that isn't the same as what they're actually doing.
But at least they're pushing back against that expectation.
Hearing it phrased like that, it sounds as if some of the anxieties that were previously loaded onto women about having to behave in a certain way in order to attract a partner have been loaded with perhaps not equal but an increasing balance onto men as well. The benefits of men being able to take on some of the positive qualities previously associated with being a woman have been kind of balanced by some of the negative pressures also coming across the gender divide.
And I suppose you made reference to the various sexual harassment cases that have been in the public domain in the last week or so. With all of that going on as well, and albeit this survey was commissioned before then, but still, you know, that's been the general background story from the last couple of years, hasn't it? Powerful men abusing their position. I think a lot of men possibly just aren't sure what they should be doing or how they should be feeling. There's a panic now around expressing their sexuality, whilst at the same time, like I say, apps such as Tinder are all about expressing your sexuality in the most brazen way possible. It's a confusing time, and maybe this survey says that.
Yeah, I just think that sounds a little bit like an excuse. I mean, I'm sorry to bring up John Humphrys again, but he was interviewing William Hague this week, and John Humphrys sort of said, you know, this is just going too far, isn't it? You're going to have male politicians in Westminster who can't even ask a woman out on a date or flirt with her. What's going to happen to flirty banter? I think that's taking it a little bit too far. I think men do know that sexual harassment and assault and rape and the very serious allegations that have been in the news are very, very different from how men and women interact in a flirty, banter way. And I think it sounds a little bit apologist to sort of saying, God, it's a confusing time. What on earth do we do?
Is it not more in the sense it's confusing that they're not sure how people are going to react to this? So even if it is what they perceive as innocent, flirty banter, they're scared that someone is going to turn around and use it against them, possibly as a pretext just to get rid of them.
I mean, quite possibly, but I feel troubled that I think a lot of very serious allegations are now sort of being conflated with a lot of minor, trivial things.
To undermine the people who really have been abused or assaulted.
But I'm not doing that. I'm just saying this context is the context in which men are being asked how they feel about the way they present in the modern world, and that is mixed and confusing. You know, if you have on the one hand the pornification of you as a young man, and at the same time a panic about talking sexually to people, that is a confusing situation.
I think that's true, but actually having more doubt about what masculinity is probably a good thing. Or at least it's a good stepping stone. Like there's been too much of a kind of received opinion about how a man ought to be. That's been, you know, breaking down over years, if not decades. A few of the stories written about this survey used Prince Harry and Robert Webb as illustrations for it. And I'm not sure either quite fit the bill. You know, Prince Harry, I wouldn't say, was a model of reliability and dependability. Robert Webb is certainly creative as well as being open about his feelings. But I think what they both do show is a willingness to air their vulnerability in public. And I think that's something that was previously seen as a definite no-no for real men.
I also add to that, I also thought it was interesting. I think last week there was a story about rugby initiation ceremonies and how there's now a huge crackdown with a lot of young men at university saying they just think it's disgusting and repugnant and they're not going to do these things anymore. And I thought, for me, I think rugby initiation ceremonies have always struck me as like the bastion of sort of male stupidity. And I think if that's going to change, I think that's really interesting. And especially if it's the bloke saying, come on, guys, I don't want to eat a dead rat out of a bucket full of ice.
All right, lads, that's enough of that kind of bants. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Holden Frith, Felicity Capon and Kari Wilkins. For more from us here at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, or you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. Remember as well that all the past episodes of this show are available on our podcast feed. You just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you're listening to this. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.